Chapter 1 of the Book of Wonder by Lord Dunsany. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sandra Cullen. The Book of Wonder by Lord Dunsany. Chapter 1. Preface. Come with me, ladies and gentlemen, who are in any wise weary of London. Come with me, and those that tire at all of the world we know, for we have new worlds here. The Bride of the Man-Horse. In the morning of his 250th year, Sheparork the Centaur went to the golden coffer, wherein the treasure of the centaurs was, and taking from it the hoarded amulet that his father, Jaishak, in the years of his prime, had hammered from mountain gold and set with opals bartered from the gnomes, he put it upon his wrist and said no word, but walked from his mother's cavern. And he took with him too that clarion of the centaurs, that famous silver horn, that in its time had summoned to surrender 17 cities of man, and for 20 years had brayed at star-girt walls in the siege of Tholden the citadel of the gods. What time the centaurs waged their fabulous war and were not broken by any force of arms, but retreated slowly in a cloud of dust before the final miracle of the gods, that they brought in their desperate need from their ultimate armoury. He took it and strode away, and his mother only sighed and let him go. She knew that today he would not drink at the stream coming down from the terraces of Vapa Niger, the inner land of the mountains, that today he would not wander a while at the sunset, and afterwards trot back to the cavern again to sleep on rushes pulled by rivers that know not man. She knew that it was with him as it had been of old with his father, and with Goom the father of Jaishak, and long ago with the gods. Therefore she only sighed and let him go. But he, coming out from the cavern that was his home, went for the first time over the little stream, and going round the corner of the crags saw glittering beneath him the mundane plain. And the wind of the autumn that was gilding the world, rushing up the slopes of the mountain, beat cold on his naked flanks. He raised his head and snorted. "I am a man-horse now," he shouted aloud, and leaping from crag to crag he galloped by valley and chasm, by torrent bed and scar of avalanche, until he came to the wandering leagues of the plain, and left behind him for ever the Arthraminorian mountains. His goal was Sretazula, the city of Somberlin. What legend of Somberlin's inhuman beauty, or of the wonder of her mystery, had ever floated over the mundane plain to the fabulous cradle of the centaur's race, the Arthraminorian mountains, I do not know. Yet in the blood of man there is a tide, an old sea current rather, that is somehow akin to the twilight, which brings him rumours of beauty from however far away, as driftwood is found at sea from islands not yet discovered. And this springtide of current that visits the blood of man comes from the fabulous quarter of his lineage, from the legendary, the old. It takes him out to the woodlands, out to the hills. He listens to ancient song. So it may be that Sheparork's fabulous blood stirred in those lonely mountains, away at the edge of the world, to rumours that only the airy twilight knew, and only confided secretly to the bat. For Sheparork was more legendary even than man. Certain it was that he headed from the first for the city of Sretazula, where Somberlin in her temple dwelt, though all the mundane plain, its rivers and mountains, lay between Shepherauk's home and the city he sought. When first the feet of the Centaur touched the grass of that soft alluvial earth, he blew for joy upon the silver horn, he pranced and caracoled, he gambolled over the leagues, pace came to him like a maiden with a lamp, a new and beautiful wonder. The wind laughed as it passed him. He put his head down low to the scent of the flowers. He lifted it up to be nearer the unseen stars. He revelled through kingdoms, took rivers in his stride. How shall I tell you, ye that dwell in cities? How shall I tell you what he felt as he galloped? He felt for strength like the towers of Belnerana, for lightness like those gossamer palaces that the fairy spider builds, twixt heaven and sea along the coasts of Zith, for swiftness like some bird racing up from the morning to sing in some city's spires before daylight comes. He was the sworn companion of the wind. For joy he was as a song. The lightnings of his legendary sires, the earlier gods, began to mix with his blood. His hooves thundered. He came to the cities of men, and all men trembled, for they remembered the ancient mythical wars, and now they dreaded new battles and feared for the race of man. Not by Clio are these wars recorded. History does not know them. But what of that? Not all of us have sat at historians' feet, but all have learned fable and myth at their mothers' knees. And there were none that did not fear strange wars when they saw Shepherauk swerve and leap along the public ways. So he passed from city to city. By night he lay down unpanting in the reeds of some marsh or a forest. Before dawn he rose triumphant, and hugely drank of some river in the dark, and splashing out of it would trot to some high place to find the sunrise, and to send echoing eastwards the exultant greetings of his jubilant horn. And lo, the sunrise coming up from the echoes, and the plains new lit by the day, and the leagues spinning by like water flung from a top, and that gay companion, the loudly laughing wind, and men and the fears of men and their little cities. And after that, great rivers and waste spaces and huge new hills, and then new lands beyond them, and more cities of men, and always the old companion, the glorious wind. Kingdom by kingdom slipped by, and still his breath was even. It is a golden thing to gallop on good turf in one's youth, said the young man horse, the Centaur. Ha ha, said the wind of the hills, and the winds of the plain answered. Bells pealed in frantic towers, wise men consulted parchments, astrologers sought of the portent from the stars, the aged made subtle prophecies. Is he not swift, said the young. How glad he is, said children. Night after night brought him sleep, and day after day lit his gallop, till he came to the lands of the Athelonian men who live by the edges of the mundane plain, and from them he came to the lands of legend again, such as those in which he was cradled on the other side of the world, and which fringe the marge of the world and mix with the twilight. And there a mighty thought came into his untired heart, for he knew that he neared Zretazula now, the city of Somberline. It was late in the day when he neared it, and clouds coloured with evening rolled low on the plain before him. He galloped on into their golden mist, and when it hid from his eyes the sight of things, the dreams in his heart awoke, and romantically he pondered all those rumours that used to come to him from Somberline, because of the fellowship of fabulous things. She dwelt, said Evening secretly to the bat, in a little temple by a lone lake shore. A grove of cypresses screened her from the city, from Zretazula of the climbing ways, and opposite her temple stood her tomb, her sad lake sepulchre with open door, lest her amazing beauty and the centuries of her youth should ever give rise to the heresy among men that lovely Cymbeline was immortal, for only her beauty and her lineage were divine. Her father had been half centaur and half god. Her mother was the child of a desert lion, and that Sphinx that watches the pyramids. She was more mystical than woman. Her beauty was as a dream, was as a song, the one dream of a lifetime dreamed on enchanted dews, the one song sung to some city by a deathless bird blown far from his native coasts by storm in paradise. Dawn after dawn on mountains of romance, or twilight after twilight could never equal her beauty. All the glow-worms had not the secret among them, nor all the stars of night. Poets had never sung it, nor evening guessed its meaning. The morning envied it. It was hidden from lovers. She was unwed, unwooed. The lions came not to woo her because they feared her strength, and the gods dared not love her because they knew she must die. This was what evening had whispered to the bat. This was the dream in the heart of Sheparork as he cantered blind through the mist. And suddenly, there at his hoofs in the dark of the plain, appeared the cleft in the legendary lands, and Zretazula sheltering in the cleft and sunning herself in the evening. Swiftly and craftily he bounded down by the upper end of the cleft, and entering Zretazula by the outer gate, which looks out sheer on the stars, he galloped suddenly down the narrow streets. Many that rushed out onto balconies as he went clattering by, many that put their heads from glittering windows, are told of in olden song. Sheparork did not tarry to give greetings, or to answer challenges from martial towers. He was down through the earthward gate like the thunderbolt of his sires, and like Leviathan who has leapt at an eagle, he surged into the water between temple and tomb. He galloped with half-shut eyes up the temple steps, and, only seeing dimly through his lashes, seized Cymbeline by the hair, undazzled as yet by her beauty, and so haled her away, and leaping with her over the flawless chasm where the waters of the lake fall, unremembered, away into a hole in the world, took her we know not where, to be her slave for all centuries that are allowed to his race. 3 blasts he gave as he went upon that silver horn. That is the world-old treasure of the centaurs. These were his wedding bells. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of the Book of Wonder by Lord Dunsany. Distressing Tale of Thangobrind the Jeweller. When Thangobrind the Jeweller heard the ominous cough, he turned at once upon that narrow way. A thief was he, of very high repute, being patronized by the lofty and elect, for he stole nothing smaller than the moo-moo's egg, and in all his life stole only 4 kinds of stone: the ruby, the diamond, the emerald, and the sapphire. And as jewellers go, his honesty was great. Now there was a merchant prince who had come to Thangobrind and had offered his daughter's soul for the diamond that is larger than the human head, and was to be found on the lap of the spider idol Hloglo in his temple of Mung Garlin, for he had heard that Thangobrind was a thief to be trusted. Thangobrind oiled his body and slipped out of his shop, and went secretly through byways and got as far as Snarp, before anybody knew that he was out on business again, or missed his sword from its place under the counter. Thence he moved only by night, hiding by day and rubbing the edges of his sword, which he called Mouse, because it was swift and nimble. The jeweller had subtle methods of travelling. Nobody saw him cross the plains of Zid. Nobody saw him come to Mersk or Tlun. Oh, but he loved shadows. Once the moon, peeping out unexpectedly from a tempest, had betrayed an ordinary jeweller. Not so did it undo Thangobrind. The watchman only saw a crouching shape that snarled and laughed. "'Tis but a hyena," they said. Once in the city of Ag, one of the guardians seized him, but Thangobrind was oiled and slipped from his hand. You scarcely heard his bare feet patter away. He knew that the merchant prince awaited his return, his little eyes open all night and glittering with greed. He knew how his daughter lay chained up and screaming night and day. Ah, Thangobrind knew. And had he not been out on business, he had almost allowed himself one or two little laughs. But business was business, and the diamond that he sought still lay on the lap of Hlo-Hlo, where it had been for the last 2 million years, since Hlo-Hlo created the world, and gave unto it all things except that precious stone called Dead Man's Diamond. The jewel was often stolen, but it had a knack of coming back again to the lap of Hlo-Hlo. Thangobrind knew this, but he was no common jeweller, and hoped to outwit Hlo-Hlo, perceiving not the trend of ambition and lust, and that they are vanity. How nimbly he threaded his way through the pits of Snood, now like a botanist, scrutinizing the ground, now like a dancer, leaping from crumbling edges. It was quite dark when he went by the towers of Tor, where archers shoot ivory arrows at strangers, lest any foreigner should alter their laws, which are bad, but not to be altered by mere aliens. At night they shoot by the sound of the stranger's feet. Oh, Thangobrind, Thangobrind, was ever a jeweller like you? He dragged 2 stones behind him by long cords, and at these the archers shot. Tempting indeed was the snare that they set in Wath, the emeralds loose set in the city's gate, but Thangobrind discerned the golden cord that climbed the wall from each, and the weights that would topple upon him if he touched one, and so he left them, though he left them weeping, and at last came to Theth. There all men worship Hlo-Hlo, though they are willing to believe in other gods, as missionaries attest, but only as creatures of the chase for the hunting of Hlo-Hlo, who wears their halos, so these people say, on golden hooks along his hunting belt. And from Theth he came to the city of Mung, and the temple of Mung Garling, and entered and saw the spider idol, Hlo-Hlo, sitting there with Dead Man's Diamond glittering on his lap, and looking for all the world like a full moon. But a full moon seen by a lunatic who had slept too long in its rays, for there was in Dead Man's Diamond a certain sinister look, and a boding of things to happen that are better not mentioned here. The face of the spider idol was lit by that fatal gem. There was no other light, in spite of his shocking limbs and that demoniac body. His face was serene and apparently unconscious. A little fear came into the mind of Thangobrind the jeweller, a passing tremor, no more. Business was business, and he hoped for the best. Thangobrind offered honey to Hlo-Hlo, and prostrated himself before him. Oh, he was cunning. When the priests stole out of the darkness to lap up the honey, they were stretched senseless on the temple floor, for there was a drug in the honey that was offered to Hullo. And Thangobrin the jeweller picked Dead Man's diamond up and put it on his shoulder and trudged away from the shrine. And Hullo the spider idol said nothing at all, but he laughed softly as the jeweller shut the door. When the priests awoke out of the grip of the drug that was offered with the honey to Hullo, they rushed to a little secret room with an outlet on the stars and cast a horoscope of the thief. Something that they saw in the horoscope seemed to satisfy the priests. It was not like Thangobrin to go back by the road by which he had come. No, he went by another road, even though it led to the narrow way, night house, and spider forest. The city of Moong went towering by behind him, balcony above balcony, eclipsing half the stars as he trudged away with his diamond. Though when a soft pittering as of velvet feet arose behind him, he refused to acknowledge that it might be what he feared, yet the instincts of his trade told him that it was not well when any noise whatever follows a diamond by night, and this was one of the largest that had ever come to him in the way of business. When he came to the narrow way that leads to Spider Forest, Dead Man's diamond feeling cold and heavy, and the velvety footfall seeming fearfully close, the jeweller stopped and almost hesitated. He looked behind him. There was nothing there. He listened attentively. There was no sound now. Then he thought of the screams of the merchant prince's daughter, whose soul was the diamond's price, and smiled and went stoutly on. There watched him, apathetically over the narrow way, that grim and dubious woman whose house is the night. Thangobrin, hearing no longer the sound of suspicious feet, felt easier now. He was all but come to the end of the narrow way when the woman listlessly uttered that ominous cough. The cough was too full of meaning to be disregarded. Thangobrin turned round and saw at once what he feared. The spider idol had not stayed at home. The jeweller put his diamond gently upon the ground and drew his sword called Mouse. And then began that famous fight upon the narrow way, in which the grim old woman, whose house was night, seemed to take so little interest. To the spider idol you saw at once it was all a horrible joke. To the jeweller it was grim earnest. He fought and panted and was pushed back slowly along the narrow way, but he wounded Hullo all the while with terrible long gashes all over his deep, soft body, till Mouse was slimy with blood. But at last the persistent laughter of Hullo was too much for the jeweller's nerves, and once more wounding his demoniac foe, he sank aghast and exhausted by the door of the house called Night, at the feet of the grim old woman, who, having uttered once that ominous cough, interfered no further with the course of events, and there carried Thangobrin the jeweller away, those whose duty it was, to the house where the two men hang, and taking down from his hook the left hand one of the two, they put that venturous jeweller in his place, so that there fell on him the doom that he feared, as all men know, though it is so long since, and there abated somewhat the ire of the envious gods. And the only daughter of the merchant prince felt so little gratitude for this great deliverance that she took to respectability of a militant kind, and became aggressively dull, and called her home the English Riviera, and had platitudes worked in worsted upon her tea cosy, and in the end never died, but passed away at her residence. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of the Book of Wonder by Lord Dunsany. The House of the Sphinx. When I came to the house of the Sphinx, it was already dark. They made me eagerly welcome, and I, in spite of the deed, was glad of any shelter from that ominous wood. I saw at once that there had been a deed, although a cloak did all that a cloak may do to conceal it. The mere uneasiness of the welcome made me suspect that cloak. The Sphinx was moody and silent. I had not come to pry into the secrets of eternity, nor to investigate the Sphinx's private life, and so had little to say and few questions to ask. But to whatever I did say, she remained morosely indifferent. It was clear that either she suspected me of being in search of the secrets of one of her gods, or of being boldly inquisitive about her traffic with time, or else she was darkly absorbed with brooding upon the deed. I saw soon enough that there was another than me to welcome. I saw it from the hurried way that they glanced from the door to the deed, and back to the door again. And it was clear that the welcome was to be a bolted door. But such bolts, and such a door! Rust and decay and fungus had been there far too long, and it was not a barrier any longer that would keep out even a determined wolf. And it seemed to be something worse than a wolf that they feared. A little later on I gathered from what they said that some imperious and ghastly thing was looking for the Sphinx, and that something that had happened had made its arrival certain. It appeared that they had slapped the Sphinx to vex her out of her apathy, in order that she should pray to one of her gods, whom she had littered in the house of time. But her moody silence was invincible, and her apathy oriental, ever since the deed had happened. And when they found that they could not make her pray, there was nothing for them to do but to pay little useless attentions to the rusty lock of the door, and to look at the deed and wonder, and even pretend to hope, and to say that after all it might not bring that destined thing from the forest, which no one named. It may be said I had chosen a gruesome house, but not if I had described the forest from which I came, and I was in need of any spot wherein I could rest my mind from the thought of it. I wondered very much what thing would come from the forest on account of the deed, and having seen that forest as you, gentle reader, have not, I had the advantage of knowing that anything might come. It was useless to ask the Sphinx. She seldom reveals things. Like her paramour Time, the gods take after her, and while this mood was on her, rebuff was certain. So I quietly began to oil the lock of the door, and as soon as they saw this simple act, I won their confidence. It was not that my work was of any use, it should have been done long before, but they saw that my interest was given for the moment to the thing that they thought vital. They clustered round me then. They asked me what I thought of the door, and whether I had seen better, and whether I had seen worse. And I told them about all the doors I knew, and said that the doors of the baptistry in Florence were better doors, and the doors made by a certain firm of builders in London were worse. And then I asked them what it was that was coming after the Sphinx because of the deed. And at first they would not say, and I stopped oiling the door. And then they said that it was the Arch-Inquisitor of the forest, who is investigator and avenger of all Silvestrian things. And from all that they said about him, it seemed to me that this person was quite white, and was of a madness that was settled down quite blankly upon a place, a kind of mist in which reason could not live. And it was the fear of this that made them fumble nervously at the lock of that rotten door. But with the Sphinx it was not so much fear as sheer prophecy. The hope that they tried to hope was well enough in its way, but I did not share it. It was clear that the thing that they feared was the corollary of the deed. One saw that more by the resignation upon the face of the Sphinx than by their sorry anxiety for the door. The wind soughed and the great tapers flared, and their obvious fear and the silence of the Sphinx grew more than ever a part of the atmosphere, and bats went restlessly through the gloom of the wind that beat the tapers low. Then a few things screamed far off, then a little nearer, and something was coming towards us, laughing hideously. I hastily gave a prod to the door that they guarded. My finger sank right into the mouldering wood. There was not a chance of holding it. I had not leisure to observe their fright. I thought of the back door, for the forest was better than this. Only the Sphinx was absolutely calm. Her prophecy was made, and she seemed to have seen her doom, so that no new thing could perturb her. But by mouldering rungs of ladders as old as man, by slippery edges of the dreaded abyss, with an ominous dizziness about my heart and a feeling of horror in the soles of my feet, I clambered from tower to tower till I found the door that I sought, and it opened onto one of the upper branches of a huge and sombre pine, down which I climbed onto the floor of the forest, and I was glad to be back again in the forest from which I had fled, and the Sphinx in her menaced house. I know not how she fared, whether she gazes for ever, disconsolate at the deed, remembering only in her smitten mind, at which the little boys now leer, that she once knew well those things at which man stands aghast, or whether in the end she crept away, and clambering horribly from abyss to abyss, came at last to higher things, and is wise and eternal still. For who knows of madness, whether it is divine, or whether it be of the pit. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of the Book of Wonder by Lord Dunsany. Probable adventure of the 3 literary men. When the nomads came to El Lola, they had no more songs, and the question of stealing the golden box arose in all its magnitude. On the other hand, many had sought the golden box, the receptacle, as the Ethiopians know, of poems of fabulous value, and their doom is still the common talk of Arabia. On the other hand, it was lonely to sit around the campfire by night with no new songs. It was the tribe of Heth that discussed these things one evening upon the plains below the peak of Mluna. Their native land was the track across the world of immemorial wanderers, and there was trouble among the elders of the nomads because there were no new songs. While untouched by human trouble, untouched as yet by the night that was hiding the plains away, the peak of Mluna, calm in the afterglow, looked on the dubious land. And it was there on the plain upon the known side of Mluna, just as the evening star came mouse-like into view, and the flames of the campfire lifted their lonely plumes, uncheered by any song, that rash scheme was hastily planned by the nomads, which the world has named the quest of the golden box. No measure of wiser precaution could the elders of the nomads have taken than to choose for their thief that very Slith, that identical thief that, even as I write, in how many schoolrooms governesses teach, stole a march on the King of Westphalia. Yet the weight of the box was such that others had to accompany him, and Sippy and Slorg were no more agile thieves than may be found today among vendors of the antique. So over the shoulder of Mluna these 3 climbed next day, and slept as well as they might among its snows, rather than risk a night in the woods of the dubious land. And the morning came up radiant, and the birds were full of song, but the forest underneath and the waste beyond it, and the bare and ominous crags, all wore the appearance of an unuttered threat. Though Slith had an experience of 20 years of theft, yet he said little. Only if one of the others made a stone roll with his foot, or, later on in the forest, if one of them stepped on a twig, he whispered sharply to them always the same words: "That is not business." He knew that he could not make them better thieves during a 2 days' journey, and whatever doubts he had, he interfered no further. From the shoulder of Mluna they dropped into the clouds, and from the clouds to the forest, to whose native beasts, as well the 3 thieves knew, all flesh was meat, whether it was flesh of fish or man. There the thieves drew idolatrously from their pockets, each one a separate god, and prayed for protection in the unfortunate wood, and hoped therefrom from a 3-fold chance of escape, since if anything should eat one of them it was certain to eat them all, and they confided that the corollary might be true, and all should escape if one did. Whether one of these gods was propitious and awake, or whether all of the 3, or whether it was chance that brought them through the forest unmouthed by detestable beasts, none knoweth, but certainly neither the emissaries of the god that most they feared, nor the wrath of the topical god of that ominous place, brought their doom to the 3 adventurers there or then. And so it was that they came to Rumbly Heath, in the heart of the dubious land, whose stormy hillocks were the ground-swell and the after-wash of the earthquake, something so huge that it seemed unfair to man that it should move so softly, stalked splendidly by them, and only so barely did they escape its notice that one word rang and echoed through their 3 imaginations: if. And when this danger was at last gone by, they moved cautiously on again, and presently saw the little harmless Mipt, half fairy and half gnome, giving shrill contented squeaks on the edge of the world. And they edged away unseen, for they said that the inquisitiveness of the Mipt had become fabulous, and that, harmless as he was, he had a bad way with secrets. Yet they probably loathed the way that he nuzzles dead white bones, and would not admit their loathing, for it does not become adventurers to care who eats their bones. Be this as it may, they edged away from the Mipt, and came almost at once to the wizened tree, the goal-post of their adventure, and knew that beside them was the crack in the world and the bridge from bad to worse, and that underneath them stood the rocky house of owner of the box. This was their simple plan: to slip into the corridor in the upper cliff, to run softly down it, of course with naked feet, under the warning to travellers that is graven upon stone, which interpreters take to be, "It is better not to touch the berries that are there for a purpose," on the right side going down, and so to come to the guardian on his pedestal, who had slept for 1,000 years and should be sleeping still, and go in through the open window. One man was to wait outside by the crack in the world until the others came out with the golden box, and, should they cry for help, he was to threaten at once to unfasten the iron clamp that kept the crack together. When the box was secured, they were to travel all night and all the following day, until the cloud banks that wrapped the slopes of Mluna were well between them and the owner of the box. The door in the cliff was open. They passed without a murmur down the cold steps, Slith leading them all the way. A glance of longing, no more, each gave to the beautiful berries. The guardian upon his pedestal was still asleep. Slorg climbed by a ladder that Slith knew where to find, to the iron clamp across the crack in the world, and waited beside it with a chisel in his hand, listening closely for anything untoward, while his friends slipped into the house and no sound came. And presently Slith and Sippy found the golden box. Everything seemed happening as they had planned. It only remained to see if it was the right one, and to escape with it from that dreadful place. Under the shelter of the pedestal, so near to the guardian that they could feel his warmth, which paradoxically had the effect of chilling the blood of the boldest of them, they smashed the emerald hasp and opened the golden box, and there they read by the light of ingenious sparks which Slith knew how to contrive, and even this poor light they hid with their bodies. What was their joy even at that perilous moment, as they lurked between the guardian and the abyss, to find that the box contained 15 peerless odes in the archaic form, 5 sonnets that were by far the most beautiful in the world, 9 ballads in the manner of Provence that had no equal in the treasuries of man, a poem addressed to a moth in 28 perfect stanzas, a piece of blank verse of over 100 lines on a level not yet known to have been attained by man, as well as 15 lyrics on which no merchant would dare to set a price. They would have read them again, for they gave happy tears to a man, and memories of dear things done in infancy, and brought sweet voices from far sepulchres. But Slith pointed imperiously to the way by which they had come, and extinguished the light, and Slorg and Sippy sighed, then took the box. The guardian still slept the sleep that survived 1,000 years. As they came away, they saw that indulgent chair close by the edge of the world, in which owner of the box had lately sat reading selfishly and alone the most beautiful songs and verses that poet ever dreamed. They came in silence to the foot of the stairs, and then it befell that as they drew near safely, in the night's most secret hour, some hand in an upper chamber lit a shocking light, lit it, and made no sound. For a moment it might have been an ordinary light, fatal as even that could very well be at such a moment as this. But when it began to follow them like an eye, and to grow redder and redder as it watched them, then even optimism despaired. And Sippy very unwisely attempted flight, and Slorg even as unwisely tried to hide. But Slith, knowing well why that light was lit in that secret upper chamber, and who it was that lit it, leaped over the edge of the world, and is falling from us still through the unreverberate blackness of the abyss. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of the Book of Wonder by Lord Dunsany. The injudicious prayers of Pombo the idolater. Pombo the idolater had prayed to Ahmoose a simple prayer, a necessary prayer, such as even an idol of ivory could very easily grant, and Ahmoose had not immediately granted it. Pombo had therefore prayed to Tharma for the overthrow of Ahmoose, an idol friendly to Tharma, and in doing this offended against the etiquette of the gods. Tharma refused to grant the little prayer. Pombo prayed frantically to all the gods of idolatry, for though it was a simple matter, yet it was very necessary to a man. And gods that were older than Ahmoose rejected the prayers of Pombo, and even gods that were younger and therefore of greater repute. He prayed to them one by one, and they all refused to hear him. Nor at first did he think at all of that subtle divine etiquette against which he had offended. It occurred to him all at once, as he prayed to his 50th idol, a little green jade god whom the Chinese know, that all the idols were in league against him. When Pombo discovered this, he resented his birth bitterly, and made lamentation, and alleged that he was lost. He might have been seen then in any part of London, haunting curiosity shops and places where they sold idols of ivory or of stone, for he dwelt in London with others of his race, though he was born in Burma, among those who hold Ganges holy. On drizzly evenings of November's worst, his haggard face could be seen in the glow of some shop, pressed close against the glass, where he would supplicate some calm cross-leg idol till policemen moved him on. And after closing hours, back he would go to his dingy room, in that part of our capital where English is seldom spoken, to supplicate little idols of his own. And when Pombo's simple, necessary prayer was equally refused by the idols of museums, auction rooms, shops, then he took counsel with himself and purchased incense and burned it in a brazier before his own cheap little idols, and played the while upon an instrument such as that wherewith men charm snakes, and still the idols clung to their etiquette. Whether Pombo knew about this etiquette and considered it frivolous in the face of his need, or whether his need, now grown desperate, unhinged his mind, I know not. But Pombo the idolater took a stick and suddenly turned iconoclast. Pombo the iconoclast immediately left his house, leaving his idols to be swept away with the dust, and so to mingle with man, and went to an arch-idolater of repute, who carved idols out of rare stones, and put his case before him. The arch-idolater who made idols of his own rebuked Pombo in the name of man for having broken his idols. For hath not man made them? The arch-idolater said. And concerning the idols themselves he spoke long and learnedly, explaining divine etiquette, and how Pombo had offended, and how no idol in the world would listen to Pombo's prayer. When Pombo heard this, he wept, and made bitter outcry, and cursed the gods of ivory, and the gods of jade, and the hand of man that made them. But most of all he cursed their etiquette, that had undone, as he said, an innocent man, so that at last that arch-idolater who made idols of his own stopped in his work upon an idol of jasper for a king that was weary of wash, and took compassion on Pombo, and told him that though no idol in the world would listen to his prayer, yet only a little way over the edge of it a certain disreputable idol sat, who knew nothing of etiquette, and granted prayers that no respectable God would ever consent to hear. When Pombo heard this, he took 2 handfuls of the arch-idolater's beard and kissed them joyfully, and dried his tears and became his old impertinent self again. And he that carved from jasper the usurper of Wash explained how in the village of World's End, at the furthest end of Last Street, there is a hole that you take to be a well, close by the garden wall, but that if you lower yourself by your hands over the edge of the hole, and feel about with your feet till they find a ledge, that is the top step of a flight of stairs that takes you down over the edge of the world. For all that men know, those stairs may have a purpose, and even a bottom step, said the arch-idolater. But discussion about the lower flights is idle. Then the teeth of Pombo chattered, for he feared the darkness. But he that made idols of his own explained that those stairs were always lit by the faint blue gloaming in which the world spins. Then, he said, you will go by Lonely House, and under the bridge that leads from the house to nowhere, and whose purpose is not guessed. Thence past Maharian, the god of flowers, and his high priest, who is neither bird nor cat, And so you will come to the little idol, Doth, the disreputable god that will grant your prayer." And he went on carving again at his idol of jasper for the king who was weary of wash, and Pombo thanked him and went singing away, for in his vernacular mind he thought that he had the gods. It is a long journey from London to World's End, and Pombo had no money left, yet within 5 weeks he was strolling along Last Street, but how he contrived to get there I will not say, for it was not entirely honest. And Pombo found the well at the end of the garden beyond the end house of Last Street, and many thoughts ran through his mind as he hung by his hands from the edge. But chiefest of all those thoughts was one that said the gods were laughing at him through the mouth of the arch-idolater, their prophet, and the thought beat in his head till it ached like his wrists. And then he found the step, and Pombo walked downstairs. There, sure enough, was the gloaming in which the world spins, and stars shone far off in it faintly. There was nothing before him as he went downstairs but that strange blue waste of gloaming, with its multitude of stars, and comets plunging through it on outward journeys, and comets returning home. And then he saw the lights of the bridge to nowhere, and all of a sudden he was in the glare of the shimmering parlour window of Lonely House. And he heard voices there pronouncing words, and the voices were nowise human. And but for his bitter need he had screamed and fled. Half-way between the voices and Maharian, whom he now saw standing out from the world, covered in rainbow halos, he perceived the weird grey beast that is neither cat nor bird. As Pombo hesitated, chilly with fear, he heard those voices grow louder in Lonely House, and at that he stealthily moved a few steps lower, and then rushed past the beast. The beast intently watched Maharian, hurling up bubbles that are every one a season of spring in unknown constellations, calling the swallows home to unimagined fields, watched him without ever turning to look at Pombo, and saw him drop into the Llanlana, the river that rises at the edge of the world, the golden pollen that sweetens the tide of the river and is carried away from the world to be a joy to the stars. And there before Pombo was the little disreputable god who cares nothing for etiquette and will answer prayers that are refused by all the respectable idols. And whether the view of him at last excited Pombo's eagerness, or whether his need was greater than he could bear that it drove him so swiftly downstairs, or whether, as is most likely, he ran too fast past the beast, I do not know, and it does not matter to Pombo, but at any rate he could not stop, as he had designed, in attitude of prayer at the feet of Doth, but ran on past him down the narrowing steps, clutching at smooth bare rocks, till he fell from the world as, when our hearts miss a beat, we fall in dreams and wake up with a dreadful jolt. But there was no waking up for Pombo, who still fell on towards the incurious stars, and his fate is even one with the fate of Slith. End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of the Book of Wonder by Lord Dunsany. The Loot of Bombashana. Things had grown too hot for Shard, captain of pirates, on all the seas that he knew. The ports of Spain were closed to him. They knew him in San Domingo. Men winked in Syracuse when he went by. The 2 kings of the Sicilies never smiled within an hour of speaking of him. There were huge rewards for his head in every capital city, with pictures of it for identification, and all the pictures were unflattering. Therefore Captain Shard decided that the time had come to tell his men the secret. Riding off of Teneriffe one night, he called them all together. He generously admitted that there were things in the past that might require explanation. The crowns that the princes of Aragon had sent their nephews, the kings of the two Americas, had certainly never reached their most sacred majesties. Where, men might ask, were the eyes of Captain Stobbart, who had been burning towns on the Patagonian seaboard? Why should such a ship as theirs choose pearls for cargo? Why so much blood on the decks and so many guns? And where was the Nancy, the Lark, or the Margaret Bell? Such questions as these, he urged, might be asked by the inquisitive, and if counsel for the defence should happen to be a fool and unacquainted with the ways of the sea, they might become involved in troublesome legal formulae. And Bloody Bill, as they rudely called Mr. Gagg, a member of the crew, looked up at the sky and said that it was a windy night and looked like hanging, and some of those present thoughtfully stroked their necks while Captain Shard unfolded to them his plan. He said the time was come to quit the desperate Lark, for she was too well known to the navies of 4 kingdoms, and a 5th was getting to know her, and others had suspicions. More cutters than even Captain Shard suspected were already looking for her jolly black flag with its neat skull and crossbones in yellow. There was a little archipelago that he knew of on the wrong side of the Sargasso Sea. There were about 30 islands there, bare, ordinary islands, but one of them floated. He had noticed it years ago and had gone ashore and never told a soul, but had quietly anchored it with the anchor of his ship to the bottom of the sea, which just there was profoundly deep, and had made the thing the secret of his life, determining to marry and settle down there if it ever became impossible to earn his livelihood in the usual way at sea. When first he saw it, it was drifting slowly, with the wind in the tops of the trees. But if the cable had not rusted away, it should be still where he left it, and they would make a rudder and hollow out cabins below, and at night they would hoist sails to the trunks of the trees and sail wherever they liked. And all the pirates cheered, for they wanted to set their feet on land again somewhere where the hangman would not come and jerk them off it at once, and bold men though they were, it was a strain seeing so many lights coming their way at night. Even then, but it swerved away again and was lost in the mist. And Captain Shard said that they would need to get provisions first, and he for one intended to marry before he settled down, and so they should have one more fight before they left the ship and sack the sea-coast city of Bombashana, and take from it provisions for several years, while he himself would marry the Queen of the South. And again the pirates cheered, for often they had seen sea-coast Bombashana and had always envied its opulence from the sea. So they all set sail, and often altered their course, and dodged and fled from strange lights, till dawn appeared, and all day long fled southwards. And by evening they saw the silver spires of slender Bombashana, a city that was the glory of the coast. And in the midst of it, far away though they were, they saw the palace of the Queen of the South, and it was so full of windows, all looking toward the sea, and they were so full of light, both from the sunset that was fading upon the water, and from candles that maids were lighting one by one, that it looked far off like a pearl, shimmering still in its haliotis shell, still wet from the sea. So Captain Shard and his pirates saw it at evening over the water, and thought of rumours that said that Bombashana was the loveliest city of the coasts of the world, and that its palace was lovelier even than Bombashana, but for the Queen of the South, rumour had no comparison. Then night came down and hid the silver spires, and Shard slipped on through the gathering darkness, until by midnight the piratic ship lay under the seaward battlements. And at the hour when sick men mostly die, and sentries on lonely ramparts stand to arms, exactly half an hour before dawn, Shard, with 2 rowing boats and half his crew, with craftily muffled oars, landed below the battlements. They were through the gateway of the palace itself before the alarm was sounded, and as soon as they heard the alarm, Shard's gunners at sea opened upon the town. And before the sleepy soldiery of Bombashana knew whether the danger was from the land or the sea, Shard had successfully captured the Queen of the South. They would have looted all day that silver sea-coast city, but there appeared with dawn suspicious topsails just along the horizon. Therefore the captain with his queen went down to the shore at once, and hastily re-embarked and sailed away with what loot they had hurriedly got, and with fewer men, for they had to fight a good deal to get back to the boat. They cursed all day the interference of those ominous ships, which steadily grew nearer. There were 6 ships at first, and that night they slipped away from all but 2. But all the next day those 2 were still in sight, and each of them had more guns than the desperate Lark. All the next night Shard dodged about the sea, but the 2 ships separated and one kept him in sight, and the next morning it was alone with Shard on the sea, and his archipelago was just in sight, the secret of his life. And Shard saw he must fight, and a bad fight it was, and yet it suited Shard's purpose, for he had more merry men when the fight began than he needed for his island. And they got it over before any other ship came up, and Shard put all adverse evidence out of the way, and came that night to the islands near the Sargasso Sea. Long before it was light, the survivors of the crew were peering at the sea, and when dawn came, there was the island, no bigger than 2 ships, straining hard at its anchor with the wind in the tops of the trees. And then they landed and dug cabins below, and raised the anchor out of the deep sea, and soon they made the island what they called shipshape. But the desperate Lark they sent away empty under full sail to sea, where more nations than Shard suspected were watching for her, and where she was presently captured by an admiral of Spain, who, when he found none of that famous crew on board to hang by the neck from the yard-arm, grew ill through disappointment. And Shard on his island offered the Queen of the South the choicest of the old wines of Provence, and for adornment gave her Indian jewels looted from galleons with treasure for Madrid, and spread a table where she dined in the sun, while in some cabin below he bade the least coarse of his mariners sing. Yet always she was morose and moody towards him, and often at evening he was heard to say that he wished he knew more about the ways of queens. So they lived for years, the pirates mostly gambling and drinking below, Captain Shard trying to please the Queen of the South, and she never wholly forgetting Bombashana. When they needed new provisions, they hoisted sails on the trees, and as long as no ship came in sight, they scudded before the wind, with the water rippling over the beach of the island. But as soon as they sighted a ship, the sails came down, and they became an ordinary uncharted rock. They mostly moved by night. Sometimes they hovered off sea-coast towns as of old, sometimes they boldly entered river mouths, and even attached themselves for a while to the mainland, whence they would plunder the neighbourhood and escape again to sea. And if a ship was wrecked on their island of a night, they said it was all to the good. They grew very crafty in seamanship and cunning in what they did, for they knew that any news of the desperate Lark's old crew would bring hangmen from the interior running down to every port, and no one is known to have found them out, or to have annexed their island, but a rumour arose and passed from port to port, and every place where sailors meet together, and even survives to this day, of a dangerous uncharted rock anywhere between Plymouth and the Horn, which would suddenly rise in the safest track of ships, and upon which vessels were supposed to have been wrecked, leaving, strangely enough, no evidence of their doom. There was a little speculation about it at first, till it was silenced by the chance remark of a man old with wandering, "It is one of the mysteries that haunt the sea." And almost Captain Shard and the Queen of the South lived happily ever after, though still at evening those on watch in the trees would see their captain sit with a puzzled air, or hear him muttering now and again in a discontented way, "I wish I knew more about the ways of queens." End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of the Book of Wonder by Lord Dunsany. Miss Cubbage and the Dragon of Romance. This tale is told in the balconies of Belgrave Square, and among the towers of Pont Street. Men sing it at evening in the Brompton Road. Little upon her 18th birthday thought Miss Cubbage, of number 12A Prince of Wales Square, that before another year had gone its way she would lose the sight of that unshapely oblong that was so long her home. And had you told her further that within that year all trace of that so-called square, and of the day when her father was elected by a thumping majority to share in the guidance of the destinies of the empire, should utterly fade from her memory, she would merely have said in that affected voice of hers, "Go to." There was nothing about it in the daily press. The policy of her father's party had no provision for it. There was no hint of it in conversation at evening parties to which Miss Cubbage went. There was nothing to warn her at all that a loathsome dragon with golden scales that rattled as he went should have come up clean out of the prime of romance and gone by night, so far as we know, through Hammersmith and come to Ardle Mansions, and then had turned to his left, which of course brought him to Miss Cubbage's father's house. There sat Miss Cubbage at evening on her balcony quite alone, waiting for her father to be made a baronet. She was wearing walking boots and a hat and a low-necked evening dress, for a painter was but just now painting her portrait, and neither she nor the painter saw anything odd in the strange combination. She did not notice the roar of the dragon's golden scales, nor distinguish, above the manifold lights of London, the small red glare of his eyes. He suddenly lifted his head, a blaze of gold over the balcony. He did not appear a yellow dragon then, for his glistening scales reflected the beauty that London puts upon her only at evening and night. She screamed, but to no knight, nor knew what knight to call on, nor guessed where the dragon's overthrows of far romantic days, nor what mightier game they chased, or what wars they waged. Perchance they were busy even then, arming for Armageddon. Out of the balcony of her father's house in Prince of Wales Square, the painted dark green balcony that grew blacker every year, the dragon lifted Miss Cubbage and spread his rattling wings, and London fell away like an old fashion, and England fell away, and the smoke of its factories, and the round material world that goes humming round the sun, vexed and pursued by time, until there appeared the eternal and ancient lands of romance, lying low by mystical seas. You had not pictured Miss Cubbage stroking the golden head of one of the dragons of song with one hand idly, while with the other she sometimes played with pearls brought up from lonely places of the sea. They filled huge haliotis shells with pearls and laid them there beside her. They brought her emeralds, which she set to flash among the tresses of her long black hair. They brought her threaded sapphires for her cloak. All this the princes of fable did, and the elves and the gnomes of myth, and partly she still lived, and partly she was one with the long ago, and with those sacred tales that nurses tell when all their children are good, and evening has come and the fire is burning well, and the soft pat-pat of the snowflakes on the pane is like the furtive tread of fearful things in old, enchanted woods. If at first she missed those dainty novelties among which she was reared, the old sufficient song of the mystical sea, singing of fairy lore, at first soothed, and at last consoled her. Even she forgot those advertisements of pills that are so dear to England. Even she forgot political cant and the things that one discusses, and the things that one does not, and had perforce to content herself with seeing sailing by huge golden-laden galleons with treasure for Madrid, and the merry skull and crossbones of the pirateers, and the tiny Nautilus setting out to sea, and ships of heroes trafficking in romance, or of princes seeking for enchanted isles. It was not by chains that the dragon kept her there, but by one of the spells of old. To one to whom the facilities of the daily press had for so long been accorded, spells would have palled, you would have said, and galleons after a time, and all things out of date. After a time. But whether the centuries passed her, or whether the years, or whether no time at all, she did not know. If anything indicated the passing of time, it was the rhythm of elfin horns blowing upon the heights. If the centuries went by her, the spell that bound her gave her also perennial youth, and kept alight for ever the lantern by her side, and saved from decay the marble palace facing the mystical sea. And if no time went by her there at all, her single moment on those marvellous coasts was turned as it were to a crystal reflecting 1,000 scenes. If it was all a dream, it was a dream that knew no morning and no fading away. The tide roamed on and whispered of mastery and of myth, while near that captive lady, asleep in his marble tank, the golden dragon dreamed, and a little way out from the coast, all that the dragon dreamed showed faintly in the mist that laid over the sea. He never dreamed of any rescuing night. So long as he dreamed, it was twilight. But when he came up nimbly out of his tank, night fell, and starlight glistened on the dripping golden scales. There he and his captive either defeated time or never encountered him at all, while, in the world we know, raged roncesvalles or battles yet to be. I know not to what part of the shore of romance he bore her. Perhaps she became one of those princesses of whom fable loves to tell. But let it suffice that there she lived by the sea, and kings ruled, and demons ruled, and kings came again, and many cities returned to their native dust, and still she abided there, and still her marble palace passed not away, nor the power that there was in the dragon's spell. And only once did there ever come to her a message from the world that of old she knew. It came in a pearly ship across the mystical sea. It was from an old school friend that she had had in Putney, merely a note, no more. In a little, neat, round hand it said, "It is not proper for you to be there alone." End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of the Book of Wonder by Lord Dunsany. The Quest of the Queen's Tears. Sylvia, Queen of the Woods, in her woodland palace held court, and made a mockery of her suitors. She would sing to them, she said. She would give them banquets. She would tell them tales of legendary days. Her jugglers should caper before them. Her armies salute them. Her fools crack jests with them and make whimsical quips. Only she could not love them. This was not the way, they said, to treat princes in their splendour and mysterious troubadours concealing kingly names. It was not in accordance with fable. Myth had no precedent for it. She should have thrown her glove, they said, into some lion's den. She should have asked for a score of venomous heads of the serpents of Lycantara, or demanded the death of any notable dragon, or sent them all upon some deadly quest. But that she could not love them? It was unheard of. It had no parallel in the annals of romance. And then she said that if they must needs have a quest, she would offer her hand to him who first should move her to tears, and the quest should be called, for reference in histories or song, the quest of the Queen's tears, and he that achieved them she would wed, be he only a petty duke of lands unknown to romance. And many were moved to anger, for they hoped for some bloody quest. But the old Lord's Chamberlain said, as they muttered among themselves in a far, dark end of the chamber, that the quest was hard and wise, for that if she could ever weep, she might also love. They had known her all her childhood. She had never sighed. Many men had she seen, suitors and courtiers, and had never turned her head after one went by. Her beauty was as still sunsets of bitter evenings when all the world is frore, a wonder and a chill. She was as a sun-stricken mountain uplifted alone, all beautiful with ice, a desolate and lonely radiance late at evening, far up beyond the comfortable world, not quite to be companioned by the stars, the doom of the mountaineer. If she could weep, they said, she could love, they said. And she smiled pleasantly on those ardent princes and troubadours concealing kingly names. Then one by one they told, each suitor prince, the story of his love, with outstretched hands and kneeling on the knee, and very sorry and pitiful were the tales, so that often up in the galleries some maid of the palace wept, and very graciously she nodded her head, like a listless magnolia in the deeps of the night, moving idly to all the breezes its glorious bloom. And when the princes had told their desperate loves, and had departed away with no other spoil than of their own tears only, even then there came the unknown troubadours and told their tales in song, concealing their gracious names. And there was one, a cronian, clothed with rags on which was the dust of roads, and underneath the rags was war-scarred armour whereon were the dints of blows. And when he stroked his harp and sang his song, in the gallery above maidens wept, and even old Lords Chamberlain whimpered among themselves, and thereafter laughed through their tears and said, "It is easy to make old people weep and to bring idle tears from lazy girls, but he will not set a-weeping the Queen of the Woods." And graciously she nodded, and he was the last. And disconsolate went away those dukes and princes and troubadours in disguise. Yet a cronian pondered as he went away. King he was of a farmer, Lule and Haf, overlord of Zerura and Hilly Chang, and duke of the dukedoms of Molong and Malash, none of them unfamiliar with romance, or unknown or overlooked in the making of myth. He pondered as he went in his thin disguise. Now by those that do not remember their childhood, having other things to do, be it understood that underneath fairyland, which is, as all men know, at the edge of the world, there dwelleth the gladsome beast, a synonym he for joy. It is known how the lark in its zenith, children at play out of doors, good witches and jolly old parents have all been compared, how aptly, with this very same gladsome beast. Only one crab he has, if I may use slang for a moment to make myself perfectly clear, only one drawback, and that is that, in the gladness of his heart, he spoils the cabbages of the old man who looks after fairyland. And, of course, he eats men. It must further be understood that whoever may obtain the tears of the gladsome beast in a bowl, and become drunken upon them, may move all persons to shed tears of joy, so long as he remains inspired by the potion to sing or to make music. Now Acronion pondered in this wise, that if he could obtain the tears of the gladsome beast by means of his art, withholding him from violence by the spell of music, and if a friend should slay the gladsome beast before his weeping ceased, for an end must come to weeping even with men, that so he might get safe away with the tears, and drink them before the Queen of the Woods, and move her to tears of joy. He sought out, therefore, a humble knightly man, who cared not for the beauty of Sylvia, Queen of the Woods, but had found a woodland maiden of his own once, long ago in summer. And the man's name was Areth, a subject of Acronion, a knight-at-arms of the Spear Guard, and together they set out through the fields of fable until they came to fairyland. A kingdom sunning itself, as all men know, for leagues along the edges of the world, and by a strange old pathway they came to the land they sought, through a wind blowing up the pathway sheer from space, with a kind of metallic taste from the roving stars. Even so they came to the windy house of thatch, where dwells the old man who looks after fairyland, sitting by parlour windows that look away from the world. He made them welcome in his star-ward parlour, telling them tales of space, and when they named to him their perilous quest, he said it would be a charity to kill the gladsome beast, for he was clearly one of those that liked not its happy ways. And then he took them out through his back door, for the front door had no pathway nor even a step. From it the old man used to empty his slops, sheer onto the southern cross, and so they came to the garden wherein his cabbages were, and those flowers that only blow in fairyland, turning their faces always toward the comet, and he pointed them out the way to the place he called underneath, where the gladsome beast had his lair. Then they manoeuvred. Acronion was to go by way of the steps, with his harp and an agate bowl, while Areth went round by a crag on the other side. Then the old man who looks after fairyland went back to his windy house, muttering angrily as he passed his cabbages, for he did not love the ways of the gladsome beast, and the two friends parted on their separate ways. Nothing perceived them but that ominous crow, glutted overlong already upon the flesh of man. The wind blew bleak from the stars. At first there was dangerous climbing, and then Acronion gained the smooth broad steps that led from the edge to the lair, and at that moment heard at the top of the steps the continuous chuckles of the gladsome beast. He feared then that its mirth might be insuperable, not to be saddened by the most grievous song. Nevertheless, he did not turn back then, but softly climbed the stairs, and placing the agate bowl upon a step, struck up the chaunt called Dolores. It told of desolate, regretted things, befallen happy cities long since in the prime of the world. It told of how the gods and beasts and men had long ago loved beautiful companions, and long ago in vain. It told of the golden host of happy hopes, but not of their achieving. It told how love scorned death, but told of death's laughter. The contented chuckles of the gladsome beast suddenly ceased, in his lair. He rose and shook himself. He was still unhappy. Acronian still sang on the chaunt called Dolorous. The gladsome beast came mournfully up to him. Acronian ceased, not for the sake of his panic, but still sang on. He sang of the malignity of time. 2 tears welled large in the eyes of the gladsome beast. Acronian moved the agate bowl to a suitable spot with his foot. He sang of autumn and of passing away. Then the beast wept as the frore hills weep in the thaw, and the tears splashed big into the agate bowl. Acronian desperately chaunted on. He told of the glad, unnoticed things men see and do not see again, of sunlight beheld unheeded on faces now withered away. The bowl was full. Acronian was desperate. The beast was so close. Once he thought that its mouth was watering, but it was only the tears that had run on the lips of the beast. He felt as a morsel. The beast was ceasing to weep. He sang of worlds that had disappointed the gods, and all of a sudden crash, and the staunch spear of Arath went home behind the shoulder, and the tears and the joyful ways of the gladsome beast were ended and over for ever. And carefully they carried the bowl of tears away, leaving the body of the gladsome beast as a change of diet for the ominous crow. And going by the windy house of thatch, they said farewell to the old man who looks after fairyland, who, when he heard of the deed, rubbed his hands together and mumbled again and again, "And a very good thing too, my cabbages, my cabbages." And not long after, Acronian sang again in the sylvan palace of the Queen of the Woods, having first drunk all the tears in his agate bowl. And it was a gala night, and all the court were there, and ambassadors from the lands of legend and myth, and even some from terra cognita. And Acronian sang as he never sang before, and will not sing again. Oh, but dolorous, dolorous are all the ways of man. Few and fierce are his days, and the end trouble, and vain, vain his endeavour, and woman who shall tell of it? Her doom is written with man's by listless, careless gods, with their faces to other spheres. Somewhat thus he began, and then inspiration seized him, and all the trouble in the beauty of his song may not be set down by me. There was much of gladness in it, and all mingled with grief. It was like the way of man. It was like our destiny. Sobs arose at his song. Sighs came back along echoes. Seneschals, soldiers sobbed, and a clear cry made the maidens. Like rain, the tears came down from gallery to gallery. All round the Queen of the Woods was a storm of sobbing and sorrow. But no, she would not weep. End of chapter 8.